Hi, I'm Lisa Fletcher, and you're in the stream. Today, targeted killings, drone strikes, and secret commandos. We go inside the world of U.S. covert activity with a correspondent who spent years traveling the globe unearthing hidden information. Our digital producer, Malika Bilal, is here looking out for all your live feedback. Malika, a lot of activity from our community on Twitter about this today, and some concern about potential overreach by the U.S. government.
Exactly, Lisa. And what's interesting is how this is all playing out on social media. A couple of days ago, someone you know, Faria al-Muslimi, not too long ago, tweeted about a drone striking his village in Yemen. He was visiting the U.S. That led to a lot of attention online. We covered that story here on a web piece on our webpage that I've just pulled up on my screen. And it led to a lot of attention, and it also eventually led to him testifying before a congressional panel on that. Now, of course, today, we're taking that discussion a little bit further and not just focusing on drones, but on the wider implications of it all. So we want you at home to join us in that conversation by tweeting us with the hashtag AJStream.
And joining us on set is author and investigative journalist Jeremy Scahill. His latest book, Dirty Wars, The World is a Battlefield, chronicles his own frontline reporting in countries like Afghanistan, Yemen, and Somalia as he explores covert U.S. activity. Scahill also spent a lot of time delving into the October 2011 targeted killing of U.S. citizen Anwar al-Awlaki. The assassination ignited a firestorm of questions regarding the legalities of killing an American and the expanding powers of U.S. President Barack Obama's administration. The book is also a film set to be released this June. Here's a clip.
I got a strange phone call. Someone from the inside was reaching out to me. Someone close to the heart of the president's elite force.
There are hundreds of covert operations on multiple continents with the full support of the White House.
It's hard to say when this story began.
Greetings from Kabul, Afghanistan.
This was supposed to be the front line in the war on terror.
What's the name of this village out here?
But I knew I was missing the story. There was another war, hidden in the shadows. A night raid.
So there's the two men in the guest house were the first people killed. You saw the U.S. forces take the bullets out of the body?
On your face! On your face!
Who were these men that stormed into Dawood's home? And why would they go to such horrifying lengths to cover up their actions?
Airstrikes, targeted killings. A lot of it was questionable legality.
How had a covert unit taken over the largest war on the planet?
Joining us now is Jeremy Scahill.
Jeremy Scahill.
They're dismissing what you've done.
Why are you still alive? Are you paranoid? Now the guy we did more with, oh, he's dead. What happened? He had an accident.
And we've got him back on AJ Stream. Jeremy, nice to have you.
Good to be with you.
Yeah, and that film comes out June 7th, right?
Correct.
Outstanding. Also with us, we have folks in our Google Plus Hangout. Our panel has a lot of questions for Jeremy, so we want to get straight into our discussion. Jeremy, dirty wars, as you call them, they lack transparency. They often identify targets before they've really, done anything. Talk about your concerns with the way you've discovered threats being identified.
Right. I mean, one of the things that happened when the Bush administration came to an end and then Barack Obama assumed office is a lot of people thought that he was going to roll back many of the policies of the Bush era, and he issued a series of executive orders that were meant to dismantle the torture apparatus, the black sites, and to close Guantanamo. Well, fast forward to 5 years from then to where we are now, and this administration is using proxy forces in Somalia in the form of warlords on the CIA payroll, expanded drone strikes, cruise missile attacks, and then also ratcheted up its support for paramilitary units of various governments around the world. So the world is a battlefield. The subtitle of the book actually comes from a military doctrine called operational preparation of the battle space that allows for U.S. military forces to forward deploy in countries where there may be hostilities in the future. And now there may be hostilities in any country because the U.S. is preemptively categorizing people as militants or terrorists based on a pattern of life, these things called signature strikes. So if you're in a particular region of Yemen, you're a military-age male, and you have been in contact with certain individuals, we no longer need to have intelligence that they're involved with a specific plot. We don't even need to know their name. We don't need to know their age or what they've actually been involved with. It's a sort of form of pre-crime. And so they get categorized as militants, and so when the U.S. kills them, they say, well, these were terrorists. But in reality, we don't actually know the identity of many of the people that we're targeting in signature strikes in Yemen or Pakistan.
You know, you mentioned Guantanamo Bay. We did a show last week on Guantanamo Bay's prisoners, and while it was obvious why some were there, you know, there are about half of them that have been scheduled for release that have yet to be released. Are you seeing any sort of shift in the field from these sort of detention modes to targeted killing, targeted assassination?
Well, you know, I mean, if you look at what some of the former Bush people have said, like CIA Director Michael Hayden and others who worked as key players in the Bush-Cheney apparatus, they're sort of saying, well, we were getting all this hell for not having gotten a warrant to wiretap people, but President Obama can order the hits of people around the world without an indictment or anything else. Now, you have to take what those guys say with a grain of salt, because it was sort of murder inc. under Bush and Cheney. But the reality is, I think that President Obama has a dilemma. He doesn't want to stick people in Guantanamo because his official position remains that it should be closed. Every time he brings someone into the country to try to prosecute them through the civilian system, people like Senator Lindsey Graham or John McCain start going all up in arms about how these people should be classified as enemy combatants. And so I think that it's in part a decision of political expediency. It's better to kill them than to have to deal with the messy judicial process of bringing them to justice. And that really is, I think, disturbing on a number of levels. Having said that, President Obama has authorized the holding of people that have been captured in between Somalia and Yemen, for instance, on naval brigs for 2 months without charge and without trial. And what they do is they categorize them as potential intelligence assets, someone that they can interrogate so that they can lead to the next action, or to save American lives, is how they put it. And this was the case, something that happened actually when they were investigating where Anwar al-Awlaki was in the world. They caught this Somali guy who had met with al-Awlaki as he traveled between Somalia and Yemen, and they held him on a ship for a couple of months. The Joint Special Operations Command did. And then eventually he was brought to the United States, and now he's in the civilian justice system, and Republicans wanted him tried as a enemy combatant. So I think that, you know, a lot of the capture operations have just become kill operations under this administration.
Well, Jeremy, you raised a lot of great points there, and we have someone in our hangout who wants to pick up on one of them. Sama al-Hamdani is a Yemen analyst speaking to us from Washington, D.C. Go ahead.
Hi, Jeremy. I actually read a little bit of your book. I haven't had the chance to read all of it, but you focus a lot on Anwar al-Awlaki. And, you know, I can see that because Americans want to focus on the American guy who got killed without trial, but then the drone programs in Yemen are killing a lot of innocent people, including women and children. So, although I haven't finished your book, I'm wondering, you know, why don't we question the legality of drones on all people, not just American citizens? And, you know...
Yeah, I'm glad that you raised that question. I mean, I firmly believe that there should be no difference in how we view these killings, whether it's American citizens or it's non-American citizens, whether it's Yemenis or Pakistanis or Somalis. On a moral level, it's all the same. And I'll have you know, if you keep reading the book, you'll note that I get extensively into the U.S. bombing of the village of al-Majala on December 17th, 2009, where 46 Yemenis were killed, 14 of them were women, 21 were children. I tell this entire story. That wasn't a drone strike, it was a cruise missile attack. But many of the stories I tell in the book actually have to do with non-American citizens and the targeting of them. But for those of us, I happen to be an American and an American journalist, and I think it's important for us to hold our own government accountable. And the al-Awlaki case is sort of a two-edged sword, because on the one hand, it cuts to the heart of what's called the targeted killing apparatus, and on the other hand, it raises questions under our own Constitution. So I agree with you and sympathize entirely with your point, and I think we should, as journalists, focus on people irrespective of their nationality. But this case also cuts to the heart of constitutional questions in the United States that are also important.
A central part of the book is the killing in 2011 of Anwar al-Awlaki. Talk a little bit about the circumstances under which he was killed and how he was killed that you discovered throughout your reporting.
Right. I mean, one thing that I think is important for, al-Awlaki has sort of been cartoonishly portrayed.
Yeah.
I mean, he, at the end of his life, the last 3 years of his life, said things I found reprehensible. He did things like calling for the killing of specific cartoonists that had drawn cartoons of the Prophet Muhammad that were offensive, I think, to many, many Muslims, but he called for the killing of specific individuals. He praised a number of plots against the United States and may or may not have met with some people that went on to attack the U.S., like the so-called underwear bomber, Umar Farouk Abdul Muttalib. But al-Awlaki never had public evidence presented against him. He was never indicted in a U.S. court. So for me, the concern is that you have the President of the United States, and this happens all the time for non-Americans too, serving as the prosecutor, judge, jury, and executioner of one of his own citizens, not to mention all of the people, as our friend on Google Hangout points out, on a regular, almost daily basis. But al-Awlaki was also a product of American foreign policy. I remember seeing him on TV after 9/11. He was the head of a very big mosque in Virginia, the Dar al-Hijra Religious Center. He condemned the 9/11 attacks, said America had a right to hunt down those responsible, and he also was very concerned about the Bush administration's rhetoric and fears that it was going to become a war against Islam. He was very much radicalized by his experience as an American Muslim after 9/11 and seeing the images of Abu Ghraib and Guantanamo and all of these things. So, the al-Awlaki family, his parents, did not raise him to be the guy you see in front of the black flag with the camouflage jacket. He was a product of America's wars, and I think that's an important part of this story to understand. So his killing was the result of a multi-year manhunt that involved signals intelligence, the CIA and the Joint Special Operations Command tracking him, and a Danish intelligence asset, a guy who was a former jihadist, helped the CIA to find a wife for Anwar al-Awlaki. It's the CIA's dating service. They actually facilitated al-Awlaki finding a wife online from Croatia. They then sent her to Yemen. She didn't know this, with luggage that had been given to her by someone that she didn't know was working with the CIA, and it had tracking devices in it.
Holy cow.
She lands in Yemen, and al-Awlaki's people, she and al-Awlaki had been communicating in encrypted email and sending each other videos. So she lands there with the CIA's luggage, and al-Awlaki's people say, ditch the luggage and just come. And he ended up marrying her and having a child with her, and she lived underground. So the CIA facilitated Anwar al-Awlaki finding a bride. I mean, you asked about how he was found. So eventually they were trying all of these things. They figure out where he is, and President Obama authorizes a strike against him. And so it was actually September 30th, 2011. Al-Awlaki was killed in a drone strike with another U.S. citizen named Samir Khan.
And that child that he had wasn't the first child that he had. 2 weeks after Al-Awlaki's killing, his 16-year-old son, who was also a U.S. citizen, was killed by a drone in Yemen. Former White House press secretary and Obama advisor Robert Gibbs stirred up some controversy with his remarks about that incident.
Al-Awlaki renounced his citizenship.
His son was still an American citizen.
Did great harm to people in this country. And was a regional al-Qaeda commander hoping to inflict harm and destruction on people that share his religion and others in this country. And
that's an American citizen that's being targeted without due process of law, without trial, and he's underage, he's a minor.
I would suggest that you should have a far more responsible father if they're truly concerned about the well-being of their children.
So the question always has remained as to whether his death was intentional. Would you consider that having been a targeted strike?
I mean, I've been investigating this since the kid was killed. I mean, I've gotten to know that family well, and I'm trying to find an answer to that. I mean, the short answer is that military officials leaked this idea that Abdulrahman al-Awlaki was 21 years old. He was actually 16 years old. He had just turned 16. We have his Colorado birth certificate. They said he was an al-Qaeda militant. Nothing could be further from the truth. This was an ordinary, lanky, goofy teenager who was a wonderful older brother to his younger siblings. He hadn't seen his father in years. He was being raised by his grandparents. He had dreams of coming to the U.S. to go to college. So when he was killed, there was this sort of despicable campaign to smear or tar him as being an al-Qaeda militant. And as I've pursued answers on this, what you run up against is people saying, well, it was just a mistake. Or they say, well, he was near an al-Qaeda guy that we were trying to kill. Ibrahim al-Bana is the name of the guy. Well, Ibrahim al-Bana is still alive. There's been no explanation. Finally, a few weeks ago, I talked to a former senior official of the Obama administration who worked on the kill team, and he told me that John Brennan, who's now the CIA director, at the time was Obama's senior advisor on counterterrorism, that Brennan believed that it was an intentional hit. Maybe it was that the Yemenis fed the U.S. bad intelligence. It happens all the time. The U.S. does a drone strike on someone they think is al-Qaeda. It turns out he's the deputy governor of a province, and that he was a political opponent of the regime, and then the U.S. did the bidding of the dictatorship in Yemen, and killed one of their people. So at the end of the day, the thing that I was told is that the reason they haven't come out, the administration hasn't come out and said this was a mistake, is because it would have been embarrassing politically for the White House. I mean, that's just shocking to me. So I don't know. Maybe it was a signature strike. Maybe it was that they got fed bad intelligence. Whatever the answer is, it's important for all of us to know why this kid was killed in that way.
Of course, you start your book out, the epilogue is on that, and it's such a touching story. It's also resonating with our community. Haj Adnan on Twitter says, wow, massive eye-opener on how unjust these cowards are, and by cowards, I believe he's referring to the U.S. He says the boy was only 16. Now, I want to go to our hangout now and get the thoughts of Ala Jarban, who's in our hangout, but speaking to us on the phone because the power has gone down in Yemen, where he's speaking to us from. Go ahead, Ala.
Hi, Jeremy.
Hello.
First, I'd like to congratulate you on the book. I'm sure many Yemenis have informed you that we're waiting for the Arabic version. My question will be about drone wars, an issue that I feel so passionate about because I'm from the governorate of Badian, which had many casualties and deaths of civilians, women, and children because of drones. A few days ago, a Yemeni young person provided his testimony in front of the Senate's Judiciary Committee. And you yourself have, in your testimony in 2010 before the U.S. House Judiciary Committee on the U.S. shadow war in Pakistan, Yemen, and elsewhere, you stated the following, and I quote, "The current U.S. strategy can be summed up as follows. We are trying to kill our way to peace, and the killing fields are going in number. With the re-election of Obama and the new administration, do you think that the U.S. strategy remains the same? And what can be done in order to stop this raw and extrajudicial killing?"
Wow. Well, thank you for that, and also thank you for the human rights work that you're doing in Yemen. It's so important that, I mean, I'm so happy that you guys are having young Yemenis on this show, because those voices are almost entirely absent from the U.S. media, and it's so important that we listen to them. Over the past few months in Yemen, before Faraya al-Muslimi's village was bombed, there had been somewhat of a lull in U.S. drone bombings in Yemen, and I'm not exactly sure why that's the case, but I do know that there is increasing public awareness of this. Things like Faraya testifying in front of the U.S. Senate are going to raise awareness, and I think that the more Americans have access to information and to the real stories of actual people that have a stake in this, then they're going to start speaking up about it. But I do unfortunately think that the policy is going to be an enduring one from Democratic to Republican administrations. And I think the next time a Republican is in office in the U.S., they're going to have a blank check to escalate this even further, because a popular Democratic president who won the Nobel Peace Prize and is a constitutional lawyer by trade has legitimized it and made it acceptable, particularly among liberals in the United States, who probably would have opposed it if it was a Republican doing it.
Jeremy, we're talking about drones. I'm sorry to cut you off, Lisa, but we're talking about drones, and I just have to get this video comment in because it's from the other side, and it's something that we don't hear about too often. Have a listen.
Is if not drones, then what? You must choose one of the other three options that are available. There is no fourth option. If you stop drones, then you basically want to, one, allow the Taliban to operate with impunity so they can terrorize the local people or go across the border and kill American soldiers, or you choose the U.S. to go and invade Pakistan. Nobody wants either one of those two options. Or three, you allow the Pakistani army to go there and conduct operations. And we've seen some operations by the Pakistani army that are disastrous and far worse than the drones.
So without drones, al-Qaeda will flourish.
Well, I mean, he's talking specifically about the situation in Pakistan and talking about cross-border attacks from the Taliban going into Afghanistan. I mean, they're going into Afghanistan to attack because the U.S. is there. But setting aside the sort of specifics of what he's saying, I mean, I believe there are not only the only options on the table are not just drones or ground troops. I mean, particularly in the case of a place like Yemen, the U.S. isn't even trying to get people extradited or brought to justice. In the case of Pakistan, that's very complicated because you have the Pakistani government is deeply implicated in colluding with terror groups as it is, and then you have the U.S. engaged in this occupation that's gone on for 12 years of Afghanistan. So it's like flypaper. I'd like to see how, if we did a moratorium on drone strikes, step back from the situation and do an actual analysis of who's being killed and why the people that are fighting against us want to fight against us, what their motivation is. I think it's long past due that we do that. Remember when the death penalty was ended in the state of Illinois in the U.S. The Governor George Ryan did it because so many innocent people had been put to death. And he said, well, we're going to halt this until we can review the system. I feel like we've reached that point with the drone strikes where we should put a moratorium on it, step back and say, let's actually do fact-finding missions to these countries. And I think the facts will speak for themselves. And I think that those that are concerned about the drone strikes are going to be proven right, that this ultimately is harming our national security, not helping it.
Speaking of fact-finding or trying to find the facts, I want to look at another clip from your upcoming documentary, Dirty Wars. When Jeremy, you ask U.S. Senator Ron Wyden of the Senate Intelligence Committee about the legal implications of targeting American citizens. Take a look.
Has there been any legal review of the potential for lethal operations against American citizens?
Is that classified? It's important for the American people to know when the president can kill an American citizen and when they can't. And yet it is almost as if there are two laws in America. And the American people would be extraordinarily surprised if they could see the difference between what they believe a law says and how it has actually been interpreted in secret.
So during your reporting, did you gain any intelligence yourself into what Senator Wyden was talking about in terms of this sort of behind-the-scenes interpretation of the law?
Yeah, I mean, and Senator Wyden multiple times in that interview had to ask, his advisor off camera if the information was classified. The state of oversight right now of the U.S. kill program boils down basically to this. This is what I've understand from my sources from talking to senators, congresspeople, as well as their staffers. There's a limited number of people that are allowed access to a limited number of documents provided by the administration that justify the legality of this. They go into rooms that are secure classified facilities. They're not allowed to bring their phones. They're not allowed to bring computers. They're not allowed to bring pens, paper, pencil, no writing utensil. They get to read the documents in that room. And when they exit the room, they're not allowed to discuss it with anyone, not their staffers, not their family members, not other members of Congress. And that is the state of oversight. So when we're talking about life and death issues, and these Congress members are seeing documents where they're reading the administration's interpretation of laws that have been published, but they're reading, wow, they interpreted this very differently than 99% of our constituents would interpret it, but we can't tell our constituents, hey, guys, it's actually, it's the death penalty now for jaywalking. That's how they've interpreted, this one clause. That's very important for people to know that the administration has determined that something is worthy of a death sentence. So we don't know the standard that's used to put Americans and non-Americans alike on the kill list. And even the people who, by law, are supposed to be reviewing this, they're not allowed to do it in any way that's meaningful. They have to go into the padded room. It's really like something out of Orwell,
Well, our community is agreeing with you. Dylan on Twitter says, you couldn't be more right about Obama's policy legitimizing and giving a blank check to future Republican administration. So, in effect, agreeing exactly with what you said. But I want to go to our hangout now and speak to Evan Sink-Mars. Evan is a master's student who has a question for us. Go ahead.
Hi there, Jeremy. Great for you to join us. Congratulations on your book. It was a great read.
Thank you.
My particular question has to do with two recent reports that stuck out to me as I was reading your book. First, by the Washington Post, that a drone base has been established in Niger to give the U.S. a foothold in Western Africa and the Sahel. And second, an LA Times article in March that the CIA has been, quote unquote, sizing up radical elements of the Syrian opposition for possible lethal action. And these reports confirm a lot of what you discussed in your book, that this particular approach to U.S. counterterrorism has been so institutionalized within the military and civilian leadership apparatus, so much so that this is the way in which the U.S. will wage war against non-state groups moving forward. And this brought me back to what I thought was one of the most important questions of your book, and one that you must have grappled with as you were writing with, as you were telling these stories from Yemen and Somalia and elsewhere. How does a war like this end? Is it possible to rein in these operations and limit or curtail the executive powers that facilitate and prioritize these operations?
This show is out of time. So we are going to have everybody tune to stream.aljazeera.com. We're going to pick it up in our online post show. Jeremy will answer that question and many more. So join us online in just a minute or so. Welcome to the Stream's online post show. We're continuing our discussion with investigative journalist Jeremy Scahill, who spent the last few years exploring U.S. secret military activities across countries like Somalia, Yemen, and Afghanistan. Also still with us is our Google Plus Hangout. We ended with Evan in Google Plus asking a question, basically, how do we limit the reign of expansion with executive power?
Right. First, he was asking also about the reports that the U.S. was setting up a drone strike that would target militants in the Sahel and West Africa. The U.S. is really heavily engaged in militarization in Africa, and I think that's one of the next grounds that we're going to see where these operations are going to take place. In terms of reining it in, there is a battle that's being waged right now by members of the Senate Intelligence Committee just to get information on how the kill program operates, even in the most generic broad strokes. And there's such fierce pushback from the administration that I think that it would really require Congress using its subpoena powers to try to call administration officials or get documents, because there's very little public outcry on this issue right now. And quite honestly, I think a lot of Americans in particular are facing their own struggles economically and otherwise and don't have time to make pushing on the drone issue part of their daily life. So it's a combination of factors.
You mentioned this earlier, though, and I think there's some truth to it. There's a lot of thought that the U.S. media is very liberal. And had this been a Republican president doing exactly what the Obama administration is doing, it would have been getting a lot more press than it's getting currently.
Yeah, a lot more press. And I think you would have seen more official pushback from the loyal opposition. I think that you would have had Democrats in Congress. There would have been hearings on this. I mean, look at when Bush was in office, just on the issue, I wrote a book about Blackwater, the mercenary company. On that issue, there were dozens of hearings. The chair of the House Oversight Committee, Henry Waxman, was holding hearings on this. They were holding hearings on torture. They were they were getting to the bottom of it because it was the Republicans in office. Now the Democrats almost never hold a hearing that would have anything vaguely resembling critical thinking about this administration's foreign policies or counterterrorism policies. Only very recently has this started. So we're 5 years into this administration, and I think it's because of what you say. I think President Obama has sold a lot of liberals the idea this is a smarter, cleaner way of waging war. We're getting the bad guys, and a small number of civilians are being killed, and our troops don't have to risk their lives going into Yemen or Somalia. That's the way it's been portrayed.
That's interesting. We have two kind of competing views here in our online community. George says, you think this only happens in the U.S.? Perhaps it's a freedom of the press like none other in the world. That is the reason you see it more. Most countries won't allow their dirty laundry to be aired. So he says the press is doing a good enough job. But on the other hand, before you answer that, there's a video comment here from Jake. Have a listen.
It's been how long since we heard the initial reports of the kill list and the way things operate, and how many innocent lives have been damaged, only to wait until now to have a Senate hearing, an actual conversation instead of empty rhetoric about the subject, or so it seems.
So even though we have hearings, is anything going to change? Is there going to be a substantive change in U.S. policy?
No, I don't think so. But I do think that when you have enough outrage from people or enough questions being asked, that policies can change. But I'm not saying it's impossible. I just don't think that there's any indication that we're going to have a major change. I do think that one of the consequences of Fareeha al-Muslimi testifying in front of the Senate, apparently he was invited to the White House. I don't know if the meeting ended up happening, not with Obama, but with one of the advisors, is that I do think that it woke up a few Congress people. Senator Durbin of Illinois, for instance, may start raising these issues. So slowly, I think we might start to see some changes. I do think that might be why we saw a lull in bombing in Yemen. I think there was pushback that was starting. So we'll see. I mean, I don't put a lot of faith in Congress, but who knows?
These kinds of operations don't exist without there being inevitable fallout.
Yeah.
What do you think the effect is, both internally and externally, for the U.S., and do you think we're creating a new generation of enemies?
I think we're definitely creating a new generation of enemies. I think the real question is, are we creating more new enemies than we're killing old enemies? In Yemen, I heard repeatedly from people, and Fareeha said this also in the Senate, we don't like al-Qaeda, we hate al-Qaeda. But you are creating a situation with your drone strikes where you're increasing the sympathy for these militants in the country. And it's the enemy of my enemy is my friend. But I also met people in Afghanistan who were victims of night raids who had been very pro-U.S. or were working with the U.S. in the police or in security forces, and after their loved ones were killed and no reasonable explanation was given for it and no compensation paid, they said, I want to put on a suicide vest and blow myself up among the Americans. I mean, this is real. This isn't just stuff that's like sort of a Taliban press release. I mean, people are furious. when their loved ones are killed, as we all would be. Look at our response to Boston. We're rightly outraged that someone set off those bombs in the streets of one of our cities at this event that's supposed to be celebrating everyone being together in an international event. I mean, if we viewed these bombings in these other countries the same way, and we sort of stopped looking at everything through the lens of nationalism and said, well, a bombing here is the same as a bombing here, that these are all people. When you have empathy for the humanity of someone else, it's a lot harder to dehumanize them as the enemy or a suspected militant. So
let's go to our hangout next and talk to Madiha. Madiha Tahir is an independent journalist who focuses on Pakistan. Go ahead. Unmute your microphone for us.
Hey, Jeremy, how are you?
Hey there, Madiha.
I'm looking forward to reading your book. I just had a question about what you just said about whether we're creating new enemies or not. And I wonder if this kind of blowback conversation always strikes me as an American conversation, to the extent that we only seem to care about other people to the extent that they might actually come back and respond to us with violence. I mean, certainly people are angry, but I wonder if, what is the other argument beyond simply a utilitarian blowback kind of argument against the drone wars?
I mean, I've talked to people who work in the U.S. intelligence community, the U.S. military community, that have said that when we do signature strikes, or we're killing someone who might have a potential intelligence value, that you are erasing your ability to actually take down a cell. If all you're doing is trying to kill people that you determine to be bad guys that may be plotting against you, it's a war of attrition. You're just kill, kill, kill. If you want to actually break up a cell or drain the swamp of the motivation for why someone would want to conduct these kind of attacks, then you actually have to do old-fashioned spy work. You have to do actual intelligence work. The U.S. has largely outsourced its intelligence operations in Yemen to Saudi Arabia, and the Saudis have their own agenda in Yemen. I mean, I remember Nir Rosen, the great reporter, said when he testified in front of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, I'm not in the business of telling empire how to run itself. But I mean, if I were an intelligence person, I'd be very frustrated with the fact that people that could have potentially given us a picture of how AQAP is organized have been killed instead of captured in many, many cases. So, I mean, I think you're going to start to see people from within the intelligence community speaking out specifically against the signature strikes, but also the whole policy of kill first and ask questions later, because it's hurting their ability to break up networks. You're just killing people. You're not necessarily breaking up the networks that may be plotting these attacks. So that's one argument that I think really pushes in favor of a halt to these strikes and reassessing the situation, even from a basic tactical level. If you think there's a threat, just killing a handful of bad guys here and there isn't necessarily going to end the threat, and it may potentially help them recruit more people for the plot.
Well, Jeremy, this has sparked a lot of conversations. I want to get one last question.
I'm already debating people on Twitter as we speak.
Good, which is exactly what we want you to do. We want to get one more question for you to debate also from Faisal Hamid. Faisal is a member of the Muslim Students Association at Yale. Go ahead.
Hi, Jeremy.
Hi.
You spoke about Imam Anwar al-Awlaki being radicalized in America post 9/11, and that's surprising because Imam Anwar al-Awlaki was so mainstream pre 9/11 and at the time. So what about American Muslims? What can we expect in the coming decade as far as illegal and legal pressure put on us and the effect that has on us?
Yeah, thank you for that question, and it's a very important one. I mean, I think that that a lot of young Muslims in the world are growing up. They're growing up in a society where the United States has been at war in multiple Muslim countries for over a decade. I mean, you could say it's gone back further than that, but in this sort of overt and covert way militarily for over a decade now. And I fear for this generation of young people because of what the U.S. has done in Afghanistan, in Yemen, in Pakistan, in Somalia, the message that's been sent. And I think the challenge is really on people of your generation to figure out a different response to all of these wars. And it's very hard. There was a reason why al-Awlaki's message resonated with a lot of English-speaking younger Muslims around the world who were very disaffected, outraged at what was happening. It makes sense why people would have listened to him, but I think that there's a great challenge to a lot of people around the world that are young and Muslim, how they're going to navigate their path in this hellish landscape that's been created by these wars. And it's why I'm so deeply moved by so many of the young nonviolent revolutionaries that we've seen around the world participating in trying to overthrow U.S.-backed dictatorships, because it was our job in the first place as citizens of the U.S. to prevent that kind of support for repressive regimes. And so I admire so many of these young people that are taking personal risks to try to change their own societies.
All right, Jeremy, we are out of time. Thank you so much for joining us. Author and investigative journalist Jeremy Scahill. If you're in the D.C. area tonight, Jeremy has a book talk and signing at Busboys and Poets. That's at 6 p.m. at 14th and U Street in Northwest D.C. Now, on our next program, we're going to look at the debate over biotech corporations and genetically modified crops in Hawaii. So send us your thoughts and your questions on that. Until then, we'll see you online.